She was sold to settle her father's debts. But the Duke changed her fate forever. Before we begin this sweeping Gothic romance, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining us. And subscribe if you adore period romances filled with mystery and second chances. Now, let's step into Elizabeth's world together. The winter wind had been howling through the village of Oakhaven for 3 nights when Mr. Cornelius Blackwell arrived at the Haven cottage. Through the frost-etched window, 20-year-old Elizabeth Haven watched the obsidian black carriage bearing the Crafton family crest roll to a stop on the frozen mud of the lane. Her breath caught in her throat. She'd known this moment was inevitable, had felt it approaching like the shadow of a storm, but knowing hadn't prepared her for the hollow ache now spreading through her chest. Inside, the cottage felt tomb-like in its silence. Her father, Thomas Haven, hunched at the splintered dining table, unable to lift his eyes from the wood grain he'd been studying for the past hour. Her mother, Anne, stood rigid by the dying hearth, her hands twisted in her apron until the fabric had gone translucent. 12-year-old Samuel sat on the stairs, watching through the banister rails with eyes too old for his years, understanding more than any child should about ruin and sacrifice. Mr. Blackwell entered without ceremony, bringing with him the scent of expensive tobacco and winter air. He was exactly what Elizabeth had imagined, impeccably dressed in charcoal wool, sharp eyes that catalogued every crack in their walls, every sign of their descent from modest comfort to desperation. An attorney's face, she thought. One practiced in separating emotion from transaction. Mr. Haven. He didn't waste breath on pleasantries as he set his leather satchel on the table with a decisive thud. Shall we conclude our arrangement? Thomas gestured weakly toward a chair. Please, won't you? That won't be necessary. Mr. Blackwell remained standing, already extracting documents from his case. The terms are simple. Your eldest daughter will enter service at Blackwood Manor in the Northern Moors as companion to His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood. Duration of service, 2 years. Compensation, the complete forgiveness of your debt of £300, plus £12 annually for household expenses. Lodging, appropriate clothing, and meals provided. Upon satisfactory completion of service, Miss Haven will receive a letter of character and £20 for her future establishment. The words fell like stones into a frozen pond, each one cracking the surface of the life Elizabeth had known. She'd heard these terms before, her father had told her a fortnight ago, voice breaking on every syllable. But hearing them spoken with such administrative coldness made them horrifyingly final. 2 years. 730 days in the household of George Crafton, Duke of Blackwood, a man the village spoke of in whispers. A man rumored to have driven his own brother from the estate. A man whose mother had died under mysterious circumstances. A man who, according to the traveling peddlers, collected rare and poisonous plants in glass houses built like prisons. The girl is of sound mind and body. Mr. Blackwell's gaze finally settled on Elizabeth, evaluating her with the same detachment one might use to judge horseflesh at market. No illness. No conditions that might prevent her from fulfilling her obligations. Humiliation burned like acid in Elizabeth's stomach, but she'd learned long ago that pride was sometimes the only possession poverty couldn't take from you. She straightened her spine, meeting his calculating stare directly. I am perfectly healthy, sir. And quite capable of managing any duties His Grace requires. Something shifted in Mr. Blackwell's expression, surprise, perhaps, that a girl in a patched dress could speak with such self-possession. He studied her more closely, auburn hair pulled into a severe knot, amber eyes that refused to yield, a simple grey wool dress that had been turned and mended so many times the original seams were nearly impossible to distinguish. She can read, Thomas said suddenly, desperately. Latin and English. Her mother educated her before he stopped himself. She keeps excellent records. She has a gift for drawing. Botanical illustrations, you see. Quite detailed. And she's Mr. Haven. The attorney's voice sliced through the rambling like a blade. His Grace requires a companion for his household, not a governess for his library. Your daughter's accomplishments, while commendable, are of no consequence to the arrangement. Of no consequence. Elizabeth felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. The countless hours her mother had spent teaching her to read by candlelight, the precious books she'd borrowed and copied by hand, the botanical journals she'd filled with meticulous drawings of every plant in the surrounding countryside, all of it rendered meaningless because she was being transferred like livestock to settle a debt she'd had no hand in creating. I understand the position perfectly, Mr. Blackwell. Elizabeth kept her voice level, though her hands trembled where she'd hidden them in her skirts. And I accept the terms as stated. Elizabeth, her mother's voice cracked. It's all right, Mama. Elizabeth didn't dare look at her mother, knowing that one glimpse of tears would shatter her carefully maintained composure. She kept her eyes fixed on the attorney. When do I depart? Dawn. Tomorrow morning. Mr. Blackwell laid 2 documents on the table with crisp efficiency. Mr. Haven, sign here acknowledging the satisfaction of debt. Miss Haven, sign here confirming that you enter this service of your own free will. Of your own free will. The phrase was almost obscene in its dishonesty. As if she had any choice when her father had gambled away their security at the card tables of London. As if she had any choice when the moneylenders had come calling, threatening the workhouse or worse. As if she had any choice when her mother had begun sewing gloves by dim light until her fingers bled, when Samuel had started sleeping in his coat because they could no longer afford enough coal to heat more than one room. But Elizabeth took the pen Mr. Blackwell offered, and in clear, unflinching script, she signed her name, Elizabeth Catherine Haven. The ink dried. The bargain was sealed. Tomorrow, she would climb into the Duke of Blackwood's carriage and disappear into the frozen moors, traded like a bolt of cloth to save her family from ruin. Tonight, she would permit herself to be afraid. What awaits Elizabeth at the windswept Blackwood Manor? Will the Duke prove to be the monster of village legend, or something far more unexpected? Continue listening to discover how a transaction born of desperation transforms into a love that defies all the rules of Georgian society. Dawn came too quickly, arriving as a pale suggestion of light behind the winter clouds. Elizabeth stood in a lane with a single worn canvas bag at her feet, containing everything she'd been permitted to bring, 2 shifts, a spare dress, her mother's silver locket, and hidden at the very bottom beneath a false layer of fabric, her most precious botanical journal. The one thing she'd refused to leave behind, consequences be damned. The obsidian carriage waited like a patient beast, its lacquered surface reflecting the grey morning. The Crafton crest gleamed in gold on the door, a raven with spread wings clutching a thorned rose. Appropriate, Elizabeth thought bitterly, for a family that seemed to specialize in beautiful things with hidden danger. Her mother had clung to her until the last possible moment, pressing a small bundle of bread and cheese into her hands with whispered blessings. Samuel had tried to be brave, but his lip had trembled when he'd said goodbye. Her father hadn't been able to meet her eyes at all. Miss Haven. The coachman, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes that seemed out of place in this cold transaction, gestured toward the carriage door. We've a long journey ahead. Best to settle in. Elizabeth nodded, refusing to look back at the cottage as she climbed inside. Looking back would break her, and she'd made herself a promise in the dark hours before dawn, the Duke of Blackwood would never see her cry. Whatever else he took from her in the next 2 years, he would not have her tears. The interior of the carriage was far finer than anything she'd ever experienced. Burgundy velvet seats, polished wood panels, even a fur blanket folded in the corner. It smelled of leather and something else, something green and growing that seemed oddly out of place in such elegant confinement. Elizabeth sat rigidly on the edge of the seat, her bag clutched in her lap like a shield, as the carriage lurched into motion. Oakhaven fell away behind them, swallowed by the morning mist. The road north climbed steadily, leaving behind the gentle hills of her childhood for something harder, bleaker. Through the carriage window, Elizabeth watched the landscape transform. Bare trees gave way to twisted thorn bushes. Cultivated fields surrendered to wild moorland, brown and desolate under the winter sky. The villages grew smaller and farther between, their cottages huddled together as if seeking protection from the wind that had begun to buffet the carriage. Hours passed. The bread and cheese her mother had packed sat untouched beside her. Elizabeth couldn't imagine eating, not with her stomach twisted into knots of anxiety and anger. Instead, she studied the moors, trying to memorize every detail as if knowledge might be armor against whatever awaited her. This was a landscape that tolerated no weakness. The wind here didn't merely blow, it screamed across the open land, bending the few surviving trees into permanent submission. Rocky outcroppings thrust up through the earth like broken bones. And everywhere, the sense of vast, empty isolation. No wonder the Duke had chosen to live here, Elizabeth thought. A man rumored to drive away his own family, to prefer poisonous plants to human company, would naturally gravitate toward a place that seemed designed to repel warmth and gentleness. As afternoon bled toward evening, the carriage began to climb more steeply. Elizabeth leaned forward, catching her first glimpse of Blackwood Manor through the gloom. It rose from the moorland like something carved from shadow itself, all dark stone and sharp angles, with dozens of windows that reflected the dying light like watchful eyes. Behind the main house, she could just make out the geometric shapes of glasshouses, their panes catching the last rays of sun in brief, cold flashes. Her new prison. Or perhaps, if the village gossip was true, her tomb. The carriage rolled through iron gates that shrieked on their hinges, past gardens gone wild with neglect, and finally stopped before the main entrance. Elizabeth sat frozen for a moment, staring at the massive oak doors. Then she remembered her promise. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and stepped out into the bitter wind with her head held high. Whatever the Duke of Blackwood expected from his newly acquired companion, he would not find a weeping, cowering girl. He would find Elizabeth Haven, and she would not break easily. The entrance hall of Blackwood Manor was a study in faded grandeur. Elizabeth stood on marble floors veined with black and gold, surrounded by portraits of stern-faced craftons whose eyes seemed to track her movement. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through windows that desperately needed washing. A chandelier hung overhead, half its candles missing, the crystal pendants dulled by neglect. Miss Haven. An elderly woman in a housekeeper's black dress descended the main staircase, her keys jangling at her waist. "I am Mrs. Hartwell. His Grace is expecting you in the conservatory." Not the drawing room, Elizabeth noted. Not even his study. The conservatory. Already, the Duke was proving unconventional. Mrs. Hartwell led her through corridors that spoke of a house slowly surrendering to time. Paint peeled from walls that had once been elegantly papered. Carpet runners showed paths worn to threads. Through open doorways, Elizabeth glimpsed rooms shrouded in holland covers, furniture ghosted beneath fabric like memories the house was trying to forget. They passed through a set of French doors, and suddenly everything changed. The conservatory was a kingdom of glass and green, a world entirely separate from the decaying manor behind them. Heat embraced Elizabeth like a living thing after the bitter cold of the moors. The air hung thick with moisture and the scent of earth, of growing things, of life persisting against all reason. Everywhere she looked, plants cascaded from shelves and climbed trellises, their leaves unfurling in shades of emerald and jade she'd only dreamed existed. And in the center of this jungle stood George Crafton, Duke of Blackwood. He was not what Elizabeth had expected. The village gossips had painted him as either ancient or monstrous, but the man before her was perhaps 30, though he carried himself with the weariness of someone far older. Tall and lean, dressed in shirt-sleeves and a waistcoat smudged with soil, dark hair falling across his forehead as he bent over a potting bench. His hands, she noticed immediately, were those of a workman, not a nobleman, stained with earth and scarred from thorns. He didn't look up when they entered, his attention fixed on a small plant with midnight dark leaves that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. "Your Grace," Mrs. Hartwell announced. "Miss Haven has arrived." A moment. His voice was deeper than Elizabeth had imagined, rough with disuse, as if he spent more time speaking to plants than people. He made a final adjustment to the plant's position, then straightened, turning to face her. Elizabeth's breath caught. George Crafton had the kind of face that would haunt portraits, all sharp angles and shadows. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth set in a line that suggested smiling was a forgotten skill. But it was his eyes that arrested her, gray as winter storms, holding a depth of exhaustion and loneliness that no amount of village gossip had prepared her for. He studied her with the same intensity he'd given the plant, and Elizabeth refused to look away, refused to let him see how her heart hammered against her ribs. "Miss Haven." He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that was more acknowledgement than greeting. "Your journey was tolerable, I trust." "It was adequate, Your Grace." Elizabeth kept her voice steady, formal, revealing nothing. Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify. He dismissed Mrs. Hartwell with a slight gesture, and suddenly they were alone among the green shadows, two strangers bound by a contract neither had truly chosen. "I imagine," he said slowly, returning his attention to the dark-leaved plant, "that you have formed certain expectations about this arrangement." "About me?" Elizabeth considered lying, offering some polite fiction. But standing in this glass house filled with exotic specimens collected from God knew where, facing this man who looked less like a monster and more like someone carrying an unbearable weight, she found herself choosing honesty instead. "The village speaks of you, Your Grace. Whether their words are true, I have yet to determine." His mouth quirked, not quite a smile, but perhaps the ghost of one. "The village speaks of many things. Most of them are exaggerations born of isolation and imagination." He finally looked at her directly, and Elizabeth saw something unexpected in those storm-gray eyes. Not cruelty, not coldness, but a bone-deep weariness tinged with something that might have been regret. "However," he continued, "they are correct about one thing. Blackwood Manor is dying. The estate is crumbling. The family name is cursed by scandal and misfortune." He gestured toward the lush greenery surrounding them, his voice dropping. "This conservatory is the only thing I have managed not to destroy. Yet." The admission was so raw, so unguarded, that Elizabeth felt her carefully constructed defenses waver. This was not the monster she'd armored herself against. This was something far more dangerous, a man who understood ruin because he was drowning in it. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I am here to fulfill the terms of our arrangement. Whatever duties you require, I shall perform them to the best of my ability." George Crafton looked at her for a long moment, and Elizabeth could not read what moved behind his eyes. Finally, he nodded once, decisive. "Then we understand each other, Miss Haven. Welcome to Blackwood Manor. Try not to let it break your heart." He turned back to his plants, a clear dismissal, and Elizabeth was led away by Mrs. Hartwell. But as she climbed the stairs to whatever room had been prepared for her, she could not shake the image of the Duke's hands, scarred and soil-stained, tending his plants with a gentleness that suggested those hands remembered how to care for fragile things. Perhaps, she thought, the greatest danger at Blackwood Manor was not cruelty, but the seductive pull of shared loneliness recognizing itself in another soul. Elizabeth's duties, as outlined by Mrs. Hartwell, were remarkably vague. She was to be available should His Grace require correspondence managed, to oversee the organization of the library, to provide companionship at meals if requested. In practice, this meant Elizabeth spent her first week wandering the manor's corridors like a ghost, trying to make herself useful in a house that had forgotten what usefulness looked like. The Duke himself remained largely invisible, appearing only briefly at dinner, where he ate in silence before excusing himself to return to his conservatory. Elizabeth found herself oddly stung by his absence, though she told herself it was relief, not disappointment. On the 8th day, restless and tired of dusty books, Elizabeth ventured beyond the main conservatory to explore the glasshouses she'd glimpsed from the carriage. What she found stopped her in her tracks. The largest glasshouse was a cathedral of dying green. Where the conservatory near the house thrived with careful tending, this structure had been abandoned to slow catastrophe. Broken panes let in the brutal moorland wind. The heating system had clearly failed, leaving tropical specimens struggling against the cold. Everywhere Elizabeth looked, she saw plants in various stages of distress, yellowed leaves, blackened stems, root rot spreading like plague through neglected pots. But it was the far corner that made her heart seize with recognition and grief. A collection of orchids, perhaps 24 varieties, stood on tiered shelving. Or rather, what remained of them. Most were already dead, their pseudobulbs shriveled and blackened. But 3, perhaps 4, still clung to life with stubborn desperation, their leaves drooping but not yet surrendered. Elizabeth knew orchids. Her mother's family had kept them in Cornwall, and she'd spent countless hours as a child learning their peculiar demands, their specific temperaments. She knew that most people considered them impossibly delicate, but the truth was they simply required understanding. Like lonely people, she thought, they withered not from fragility but from neglect. She didn't think. She simply moved. Within an hour, she'd found tools in a garden shed, blankets in a linen closet, and set to work with focused intensity. She wrapped the surviving orchids against the cold, moved them away from the broken panes. She examined roots with gentle fingers, cutting away rot with a knife she'd sterilized in the kitchen fire. The soil was wrong, too dense and waterlogged, so she created new growing medium from bark chips and charcoal she discovered in the potting room. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her. "What are you doing?" Elizabeth spun around, her hands covered in soil, to find George Crafton standing in the doorway of the glasshouse. His expression was unreadable, but his body was rigid with something that might have been shock or anger. "Your Grace, she straightened, refusing to appear ashamed even as her heart raced. "I found the glasshouse. The orchids were dying. I thought I might. Those orchids are beyond saving." His voice was flat, final. "The heating system failed a month ago. I haven't had the funds to repair it. Not all of them are beyond saving." Elizabeth gestured to the 4 she'd been working on. "These still have viable root systems. With proper care, they could recover." George moved closer, his eyes scanning her work with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how she must look, her hair falling from its pins, her dress smudged with dirt, utterly improper and completely absorbed in her task. "You know orchids." It wasn't a question. "My mother's family cultivated them in Cornwall. I learned as a child." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "These are rare specimens, Your Grace. It would be a shame to let them die when they might yet be saved." Something shifted in his expression, the storm-gray eyes brightening with what might have been hope or perhaps simply surprise at finding someone who understood his obsession. "Show me what you've done." Elizabeth walked him through her interventions, explaining root rot and humidity requirements, demonstrating how she'd created drainage and protection against the cold. As she spoke, she felt something unfamiliar unfurling in her chest, the simple joy of discussing something she loved with someone who might actually understand. George listened with absolute attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed a depth of botanical knowledge that matched her own. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, studying the orchids with an expression of such naked longing it made her chest ache. "Miss Haven," he said finally, his voice rough with something that sounded dangerously close to emotion, "I have been attempting to save these plants for weeks. You accomplished in an afternoon what I could not achieve in a month." He turned to face her fully, and Elizabeth saw something new in his eyes, respect, genuine and unstudied. "How did you learn this?" "The same way you learned to care for the plants in your conservatory, I imagine." Elizabeth couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "By loving them enough to pay attention." George's expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing into something that might, in another moment, become a smile. "Would you," he began, then paused, as if the words were unfamiliar in his mouth, "would you be willing to help me restore this glasshouse? I realize it falls outside the scope of your duties, but—" "Yes." Elizabeth didn't let him finish, didn't let him reduce this to contractual obligation. "Yes, Your Grace. I would very much like that." For the first time since Elizabeth had arrived at Blackwood Manor, George Crafton smiled. It transformed his entire face, chasing away the shadows and revealing the man he might have been before loneliness and loss had carved themselves into his features. "Then we begin tomorrow at dawn," he said. "And Miss Haven?" "Call me George." 3 weeks into their collaboration, the glasshouse had begun to transform. The broken panes had been replaced, the heating system coaxed back to reluctant life. More remarkably, Elizabeth and George had fallen into an easy rhythm of work that felt less like duty and more like a conversation conducted in soil and stem and careful observation. Tonight, they'd stayed later than usual. One of the orchids, a rare specimen George had acquired from a collector in Ceylon, had finally decided to bloom after years of sullen dormancy. Neither of them could bear to leave before witnessing the moment the flower opened. The conservatory glowed with lamplight, casting dancing shadows across the glass walls. Outside, the moors stretched black and infinite beneath a sky scattered with winter stars. Inside, warmth and the green scent of growing things created a world entirely separate from the cold manor beyond. Elizabeth sat on a wooden stool, her botanical journal open on her lap, sketching the orchid's emerging bloom with focused precision. George stood beside the plant, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, making minute adjustments to its position to catch the lamplight at the perfect angle. "The spatha is beginning to unfurl," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Look at the pigmentation. I've never seen that particular shade of crimson before." Elizabeth's pencil moved across the paper, capturing the delicate curve of the petal, the way it seemed to glow from within like stained glass held to sun. "It's magnificent. All those years of waiting, and in a single night, it justifies everything. Rather like people, I suppose." George's voice held a strange quality, something softer than his usual careful formality. We wait and wait for the moment we're allowed to become ourselves. Elizabeth's hand stilled. She looked up to find George staring not at the orchid but at some distant point beyond the glass, his expression unguarded in the lamplight. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her in all their weeks of working together. "Are you not yourself, Your Grace?" She used his title deliberately, a gentle reminder of the distance he usually maintained between them. "George." He corrected her without looking away from the darkness beyond the glass. "And no, I don't believe I am. The Duke of Blackwood is a title, a weight, a collection of expectations and failures. George Crafton, the man who simply wants to study plants and live quietly, is someone I barely remember being." Elizabeth set down her pencil, giving him her full attention. "I understand that. More than you might think." Now he did look at her, those storm-gray eyes sharp with sudden focus. "How could you possibly understand? You who have—" He stopped himself, but Elizabeth knew what he'd been about to say. "You who have nothing. No title, no estate, no burden of ancestry." "I understand," she said quietly, with no anger, only truth, "because I am not Elizabeth Haven anymore either. I am the girl who was sold. That is what I hear in every whisper, see in every pitying glance from the servants. My name no longer belongs to me. It belongs to my father's shame." Something shifted in George's expression, a cracking of the careful wall he kept between them. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched at the corners of his eyes, the burden of sleepless nights and endless worry. "I did not want to acquire you like property," he said, and his voice was rough with what might have been guilt. "But your father's creditor was a man I knew, and when he mentioned the situation, I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "I thought I could help. That I could offer terms more bearable than what others might demand. Instead, I simply made you a prisoner in a different cage." "And what of you?" Elizabeth asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Are you not equally trapped? By a title you didn't ask for, an estate that drains you dry, a family curse that keeps you isolated on these moors?" George laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "My brother understood that before I did. He fled to London, changed his name, lives as a common merchant now and claims to be happier than he ever was as Lord Crafton's second son." His hand came to rest on the potting bench, fingers spreading across the worn wood. "Sometimes I envy him his freedom." "Then why stay?" Elizabeth's question hung between them like the orchid's perfume, sweet and dangerous. "Because someone must." George's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Because this estate employs 30 families who would have nowhere else to go. Because the glasshouses contain specimens found nowhere else in England. Because running away would prove everyone right about the Crafton curse, about my unworthiness." He met her eyes, and Elizabeth saw in them a reflection of her own trapped desperation. "Because I am bound by duty as surely as you are bound by debt." Elizabeth stood, setting her journal aside, and moved to stand beside him, looking at the orchid that had finally chosen tonight to reveal its beauty. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we are not as trapped as we believe. This flower waited years for the right moment to bloom. It didn't force itself open before it was ready simply because someone expected it to." George turned to her, and in the lamplight, his face was transformed by something fragile and honest. "Miss Haven, Elizabeth, you have a remarkable talent for making me question the bars of my own cage." "That," Elizabeth said, allowing herself a small smile, "is because I am learning from a remarkable teacher. You've spent years creating beauty in a place everyone else says is cursed. That takes a kind of courage I'm only beginning to understand. The orchid chose that moment to unfurl completely, its crimson petals spreading like wings in the warm air, releasing a scent that was at once exotic and achingly sweet. George and Elizabeth stood in silence, watching the culmination of years of patient care transform into a single perfect moment of bloom. "Thank you," George said finally, so quietly Elizabeth almost didn't hear him. "For seeing past the Duke to the man. For understanding what these plants mean to me. For not running away from Blackwood Manor screaming." Elizabeth's laugh was genuine, surprised out of her. "The nights are still young, Your Grace." "George," he corrected again, but this time he was smiling, that rare expression that made him look younger, less burdened, almost free. "George," Elizabeth agreed, and felt something shift between them, some invisible thread pulling taut with possibility and danger in equal measure. Lord Julian Crafton arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, when the first tentative hints of spring had begun to soften the brutal moorland landscape. Elizabeth was in the glasshouse, carefully transplanting seedlings, when she heard the commotion of an arrival, the clatter of hooves and wheels on gravel, voices raised in greeting that held more performance than warmth. She straightened, wiping soil from her hands, and moved to the glass wall overlooking the drive. A carriage far more ornate than George's stood before the manor, lacquered in cream and gold, pulled by matching grey horses that spoke of wealth displayed rather than wealth simply possessed. The man who emerged was everything George was not, golden-haired where George was dark, dressed in the height of London fashion, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. Mrs. Hartwell appeared at the glasshouse door, her usual composure fractured by something that looked like worry. "Miss Haven, His Grace requests your presence in the drawing-room. Lord Julian has arrived." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. She'd heard the name in whispered conversations between the servants, George's cousin and rival, the man who believed the dukedom should have passed to his father's line, who waited like a carrion bird for George to fail spectacularly enough to justify a challenge to the succession. She changed quickly into one of the dresses George had commissioned for her, a simple but well-made gown in deep green that lent her an air of respectability she desperately hoped would serve as armor. When she entered the drawing-room, she found George standing by the fireplace, his posture rigid with barely suppressed tension. Lord Julian occupied the best chair as if he already owned it, a glass of George's whiskey in one hand. "Ah," Julian said, rising with exaggerated courtesy as Elizabeth entered. "The mysterious Miss Haven. I've heard so much about you." Elizabeth curtsied, keeping her expression neutral. "Lord Julian. Welcome to Blackwood Manor." "Welcome." Julian's smile was all teeth. "How delightfully proprietary. One might almost think you mistress here rather than, what was the arrangement exactly, cousin? A companion acquired to settle a debt? How very medieval of you. Julian." George's voice carried a warning, but his cousin ignored it, circling Elizabeth like a collector examining a new acquisition. "You must forgive my curiosity, Miss Haven, but the circumstances of your residence here have caused quite the stir in certain circles. A young woman of no family, no connections, living in isolation with an unmarried duke." He paused, letting the implications hang heavy in the air. "Surely you can see how such an arrangement invites speculation." Elizabeth felt heat crawl up her neck, but she refused to look away from Julian's calculating blue eyes. "I serve as companion and assistant in His Grace's botanical work. There is nothing scandalous in honest employment." "Honest employment." Julian savored the words as if they were particularly fine wine. "How charmingly you phrase it. Though I wonder how honest the employment is when the employee cannot leave without breaching a contract that would ruin her family entirely." He turned to George, abandoning all pretense of civility. Really, George, even by your standards of eccentricity, this is beyond the pale. Keeping a girl in bondage to work off her father's gambling debts. It's practically feudal. One wonders what the king's advisors would make of it. George moved forward, positioning himself between Julian and Elizabeth with deliberate intent. My arrangement with Miss Haven is perfectly legal and conducted with the full knowledge of all parties involved. Your insinuations are both unwelcome and unfounded. Are they? Julian's expression hardened, the facade of pleasant mockery falling away to reveal something colder beneath. Because from where I stand, cousin, this looks remarkably like a man of questionable judgment engaging in a transaction that borders on trafficking. The craft and name has already suffered enough scandal without you adding the disgrace of exploiting vulnerable young women to the family legacy. You dare. George's hands clenched at his sides, and Elizabeth saw the effort it took him to maintain control. I dare because someone must. Julian set down his glass with deliberate care. The dukedom requires a man of unimpeachable character, George. You've isolated yourself here, let the estate fall to ruin, and now you've acquired a young woman in circumstances that would make a brothel keeper blush. He smiled, but it was a predator's expression. I've already written to Lord Chancellor Pembroke. Merely expressing my concerns about the state of affairs at Blackwood, you understand. Nothing official. Yet. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face as she understood what Julian was truly saying. He would weaponize her presence, her father's debt, the impropriety of her situation, to challenge George's fitness for the title. And he would destroy her reputation in the process, making her unemployable, unmarriageable, ruined beyond recovery. What do you want, Julian? George's voice was deadly quiet. Want? Julian's smile widened. Why, only to see the dukedom in capable hands. Step aside gracefully, cousin. Acknowledge that you lack the temperament and judgment for the position. Let me assume the responsibilities you've so clearly proven unable to manage. He glanced at Elizabeth with feigned sympathy. I'll even be generous with Miss Haven. A small settlement, a letter of reference, passage to the colonies perhaps. Somewhere she can start fresh without the shadow of this unfortunate scandal following her. Elizabeth found her voice, though it trembled with rage rather than fear. I am not a pawn in your political ambitions, Lord Julian. No. Julian's laugh was cruel. Then what are you, Miss Haven? A debt slave working off her father's sins? A kept woman masquerading as a companion? Either way, you're precisely what I need to prove my dear cousin's unfitness for his position. George stepped forward, and for a moment, Elizabeth thought he might strike his cousin. Instead, he spoke with icy precision. Get out of my house, Julian. And understand this clearly, I will not surrender the dukedom, and I will not allow you to destroy Miss Haven's reputation to satisfy your ambition. Julian gathered his gloves with studied casualness. The winter masquerade is in 3 weeks. All of society will be watching to see if the Duke of Blackwood has finally lost what little standing he has left. I do hope you'll attend, cousin. It would be such a shame to have the scandal break without you there to witness it. He bowed mockingly to Elizabeth, nodded to George, and swept from the room, leaving behind a silence that felt like the aftermath of an explosion. The winter masquerade was held at Thornfield House, the ancestral seat of the Earl of Westmore, and it was precisely the sort of glittering affair Elizabeth had only read about in novels. Crystal chandeliers blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and polished marble. The cream of society swirled through the ballroom in silks and satins, their faces half hidden behind elaborate masks that gave the entire evening an air of dangerous fantasy. Elizabeth wore a gown of midnight blue that George had insisted she commission, far finer than anything she'd ever owned. Her mask was silver filigree, delicate as frost. She should have felt like a princess in a fairy tale. Instead, she felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. George had been insistent they attend, his jaw set with grim determination. "We will not hide," he'd said. "We will not give Julian the satisfaction of seeing us cower." But now, standing at the edge of the ballroom with curious eyes tracking their every movement, Elizabeth wondered if defiance was simply another word for foolishness. "Miss Haven." The voice came from behind her mask, dripping with false sweetness. Lady Catherine Pembroke, Lord Julian's sister, materialized from the crowd with a cluster of fashionable women in her wake. "How unexpected to see you here. I wasn't aware that companions were typically included in invitations of this caliber." Elizabeth's fingers tightened on her fan. His Grace was kind enough to extend the invitation. "Kind?" Lady Catherine's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Yes, His Grace has been remarkably kind to you, hasn't he? Clothing you in silks, parading you about as if you were something more than a debt repaid in human form." The women around her tittered, the sound spreading like poison through the nearby guests. Elizabeth felt the attention of the room shifting toward them, conversations falling silent as people turned to watch the spectacle. This was what Julian had orchestrated, she realized with sick clarity. Not a private confrontation, but a public humiliation designed to make her presence at George's side untenable. "Tell me, Miss Haven," Lady Catherine continued, her voice rising just enough to carry, "how exactly does one work off a debt of £300? Surely it requires a very particular set of skills to satisfy a duke's requirements." The implication was clear, vicious, and utterly destroying. Elizabeth heard gasps, saw fans snap open to hide scandalized smiles. Her cheeks burned beneath her mask, but she lifted her chin, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Lady Catherine, you presume." "I presume nothing." The woman's eyes glittered with malice. "I merely observe what all of society can plainly see. A duke living in isolation with a young woman of no breeding, no family, no. That is quite enough." George's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade. He appeared at Elizabeth's side, and even masked, his presence commanded immediate attention. The room fell into absolute silence, every eye now fixed on the Duke of Blackwood and his notorious companion. "Lady Catherine," George said, his voice carrying an edge of steel Elizabeth had never heard before, "you will apologize to Miss Haven immediately, or I will ensure that you and your brother are never again welcomed at any gathering I attend." Lady Catherine's face paled beneath her mask. "Your Grace, You merely attempted to destroy the reputation of a woman under my protection." George's eyes swept the assembled crowd, and Elizabeth saw several people step back from the intensity of his gaze. "Let me make something perfectly clear to everyone present. Miss Haven is not my servant. She is not my kept woman. She is the most accomplished botanist I have had the privilege of working with, a woman of intelligence and dignity, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." The silence was deafening. Elizabeth's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. This was madness. George was staking his already fragile reputation on defending her, painting a target on his back for Julian to exploit. Then, before she could process what was happening, George turned to her and bowed with perfect courtesy. "Miss Haven, would you do me the honor of this dance?" Elizabeth stared at him, understanding the enormity of what he was offering. To dance with her now, in front of all of society, after defending her so publicly, was to declare her his equal. It was social suicide for a duke already suspected of impropriety. It was exactly what Julian wanted. "Your Grace," she whispered, "you don't have to." "I know." His storm-gray eyes met hers through their masks, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Not duty, not obligation, but something fierce and defiant and achingly tender. "I want to, Elizabeth. Let me show them who you truly are." She placed her hand in his, felt his fingers close around hers with gentle certainty, and let him lead her onto the dance floor. The orchestra, after a moment of shocked hesitation, struck up a waltz. George pulled her into position, his hand settling at her waist with possessive care. They began to move, and Elizabeth discovered that he danced the way he tended his plants, with focused grace and complete attention. The ballroom spun around them, a blur of scandalized faces and glittering masks, but Elizabeth found she could only see George, his expression visible now that they were close enough for masks not to matter. "They're staring," she murmured. "Let them stare." His voice was low, meant only for her. "Let them see that I choose you, Elizabeth. Not as payment for a debt, not as a transaction, but as the woman who saved more than my orchids. You saved me from becoming a ghost in my own life." Elizabeth felt tears prick behind her eyes. "George, Julian will use this. He'll say you've gone mad, that I've bewitched you. Then let him say it." George's hand tightened at her waist, pulling her infinitesimally closer. "I have spent my entire life doing what was expected, what was proper, what would preserve the family name. And I have been miserable. You, Elizabeth Haven, are the first choice I have made for myself in a decade. I will not apologize for it." The music swelled, carrying them through turns that felt less like dance steps and more like a declaration of war against everyone who would see them torn apart. When the waltz ended, George kept her hand in his, facing the assembled crowd with his jaw set and his shoulders squared. Lord Julian stood at the edge of the ballroom, his expression unreadable behind his mask. But Elizabeth could feel his fury radiating across the space like heat from a forge. The battle lines had been drawn. And George had chosen his side. They returned to Blackwood Manor in the early hours of morning, the carriage swaying through darkness that felt less protective than oppressive. George had barely spoken since they'd left Thornfield House, his jaw tight with thoughts he wouldn't share. Elizabeth watched him from across the carriage, this man who had just risked everything to defend her honor, and felt her heart twist with equal parts gratitude and dread. She knew what was coming. She'd seen it in the eyes of every guest at the masquerade, heard it in the whispers that had followed them like a malicious tide. George had declared himself, and society would make him pay. Inside the manor, George went directly to his study. Elizabeth followed, unable to bear the silence any longer, and found him standing before the dying fire, a leather bag clutched in his hands. When he turned to face her, his expression was carefully neutral, the mask of the Duke firmly back in place. "Elizabeth." Her name sounded like an apology. "Please, sit." She remained standing. "Whatever you're about to say, I prefer to hear it eye to eye." Something flickered across his face, might have been pain, might have been admiration. He set the leather bag on his desk with a heavy thud that spoke of coins, of weight, of finality. "Julian will petition the Court of Chancery within the week," George said, his voice stripped of inflection. "He'll argue that my judgment is impaired, that I've engaged in conduct unbecoming of a peer, that I'm unfit to hold the dukedom. After tonight's display, he has ammunition enough to make a compelling case." "Display?" Elizabeth's voice sharpened. "Is that what you call defending me? A display? I call it the truth spoken at the worst possible moment. George's control cracked slightly, exhaustion bleeding through. Elizabeth, I do not regret what I said or what I did. But I cannot pretend there won't be consequences. For both of us. He gestured to the bag. That contains £500. More than enough to settle your father's debt with a substantial sum remaining. I've also prepared letters of introduction to several botanical gardens and estates that would welcome someone of your expertise. His voice dropped. You could go to Cornwall, to your mother's family. Or London. Or anywhere far from the scandal that's about to consume Blackwood Manor. Elizabeth stared at him, understanding crystallizing into something cold and sharp in her chest. You're dismissing me. I'm offering you freedom. George's hands clenched at his sides. The contract that bound you here was signed under duress. Your father's debt will be satisfied. You owe me nothing, Elizabeth. You never did. I owe you nothing, she repeated, tasting the bitterness of the words. So after months of working side by side, after teaching me to see beauty in impossible things, after defending my honor in front of everyone who matters in your world, you're paying me to disappear? I'm protecting you. George's voice rose, the careful control finally shattering. Do you understand what Julian will do? He'll drag your name through every courtroom and newspaper in England. He'll paint you as a temptress who ensnared a vulnerable duke. He'll question your virtue, your character, your very worth as a human being, and he'll do it all in public where I cannot shield you from it. I don't want to be shielded. Elizabeth's own fury rose to meet his. I want to stand beside you and fight. But apparently, you'd rather I run away like some helpless damsel who can't bear the weight of scandal. This isn't about bearing weight. This is about surviving what's coming. George moved toward her, his face stark with emotion. Elizabeth, if you stay, you'll be ruined. Utterly and completely. No respectable household will employ you. No decent man will court you. You'll be marked forever by this association. And what of you? Elizabeth closed the distance between them, refusing to let him retreat behind propriety. If I leave now, Julian wins. He proves that you care more about appearances than truth, that you'll abandon anyone who becomes inconvenient. Is that the man you want to be? George flinched as if she'd struck him. I want to be the man who protects the people he stopped himself, jaw working. The people who matter to him. Then let me choose. Elizabeth's voice softened, but her resolve remained iron. You offered me freedom once before, in the conservatory, when you said I could leave if I wanted. I chose to stay. I choose to stay now. Elizabeth, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart hammer beneath her palm. I understand that somewhere between the orchids and the midnight sketches and the masquerade, I stopped being here because of a debt. I'm here because there's nowhere else I want to be. George's hand came up to cover hers, his touch gentle despite the tension thrumming through him. If you stay, I cannot promise victory. Julian is right about one thing, I have let this estate crumble. I have made mistakes. The court may rule in his favor. Then we'll face that together. Elizabeth met his storm-gray eyes steadily. I'm not afraid of losing, George. I'm only afraid of not fighting. You're remarkable, he whispered, and his voice carried wonder and grief in equal measure. Impossibly, devastatingly remarkable. I'm stubborn, Elizabeth corrected with a slight smile. There's a difference. George pulled her hand from his chest but didn't release it, his thumb tracing circles on her wrist as if memorizing the shape of her pulse. If you stay, Elizabeth, I need you to understand something. I'm not keeping you here out of obligation or because the orchids need tending. He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with vulnerability. I'm asking you to stay because I have fallen quite desperately in love with you, and the thought of facing any of this without you is unbearable. Elizabeth's breath caught. The words hung between them, fragile and fierce, changing everything and nothing all at once. Then it's fortunate, she said, her voice trembling only slightly, that I fell in love with you somewhere between the dying glasshouse and the moment you asked me to call you George. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, as if she were something precious he'd been given permission to hold. When they broke apart, Elizabeth reached past him and pushed the leather bag of coins off the desk. It hit the floor with a satisfying thud. I choose to stay, she said firmly. I choose to fight. I choose you, George Crafton. Now let's go find your mother's legal documents and build a case that Julian will never see coming. For the first time since the masquerade, George smiled, and it was bright enough to chase the shadows from the room. George's mother arrived at Blackwood Manor 3 days later, summoned by an urgent letter that had crossed half of England to reach her cottage in Bath. The Dowager Duchess Crafton was nothing like Elizabeth had imagined. Small and sharp-eyed, dressed in elegant black with silver hair coiled severely beneath a widow's cap, she swept into the manor like a general surveying a battlefield. George. She embraced her son with surprising tenderness before turning to Elizabeth with assessing eyes. So you're the young woman who's caused such a delightful uproar. Miss Haven, I presume. Elizabeth curtsied, acutely aware of the soil still embedded beneath her fingernails from that morning's work in the glasshouse. Your Grace. I apologize for the circumstances of our meeting. Apologize? The Dowager's laugh was unexpected, warm and genuine. My dear, you've accomplished what I've been attempting for a decade, you've made my son remember he's alive. I should be thanking you. Her expression sobered. Though I understand Julian is making rather a nuisance of himself. He's petitioned the Court of Chancery, George said grimly. Claims I've engaged in immoral conduct by bringing Elizabeth here under terms that amount to indentured servitude. He's arguing my judgment is fatally compromised. Julian always was a pompous little weasel. The Dowager settled into a chair with the air of someone preparing for battle. Show me everything. The original contract, the correspondence, all of it. They spent hours in George's study, documents spread across every surface. Elizabeth watched the Dowager read with fierce concentration, occasionally muttering under her breath or making sharp notations in the margins. As evening shadows lengthened across the moors, she finally set down the last paper and fixed her son with a penetrating stare. George, did you know that under the Settlement Act of 1701, any contract of employment entered into for the purposes of estate management is exempt from standard service limitations? George frowned. The Settlement Act applies to agricultural workers and tenant farmers, not just agricultural workers. The Dowager's eyes gleamed with something that might have been triumph. It applies to anyone whose employment directly contributes to the maintenance and preservation of an aristocratic estate, including botanical specialists engaged in the conservation of rare specimens. Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken. The orchids? The orchids. The Dowager pulled out another document, one Elizabeth recognized as the detailed inventory George had compiled of the glasshouse collection. Your husband's great-grandfather, George, was a passionate collector. He petitioned the Crown for special status for Blackwood's botanical holdings, arguing they were of national significance. The petition was granted in 1723. Every specimen in those glasshouses is technically under royal protection. George leaned forward, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. Which means anyone employed to maintain them is not a common servant but a royal conservator. His mother smiled with unmistakable satisfaction. Miss Haven wasn't employed to settle a debt, George. She was employed to preserve specimens of national importance. The fact that her salary happened to cancel her father's obligation is merely an ancillary benefit. Elizabeth's mind raced through the implications. But the contract was signed before I'd even seen the orchids. How could anyone claim I was hired specifically for conservation work? Because, the Dowager said, pulling out yet another paper, according to this letter of recommendation written by your mother's cousin in Cornwall, you have extensive experience with rare botanical specimens, particularly orchids. George, did you not request this reference before finalizing Miss Haven's employment? George stared at his mother, then at Elizabeth, comprehension spreading across his face like sunrise. I did request references. Standard practice for any specialized position. Then you hired Miss Haven based on her qualifications, not simply to satisfy a debt. The Dowager arranged the documents with precise care. You employed a botanist to save your great-grandfather's legacy. That she also needed employment to help her family is immaterial to the primary purpose of the arrangement. Elizabeth felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of shame and anger she hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to unravel. I wasn't bought. You were never bought, dear girl. The Dowager's voice gentled. You were hired for your expertise, compensated for your work, and have exceeded all expectations in your position. Julian can argue until he's blue in the face, but the law is rather clear on this matter. He'll still claim impropriety, George said, though his voice carried new strength. The living arrangements, the isolation, will be entirely resolved, his mother interrupted smoothly, when you marry her. The silence that followed was absolute. Elizabeth's heart stopped, then resumed at triple speed. George had gone very still, his eyes fixed on his mother with an expression caught between hope and disbelief. Mother, I cannot ask Elizabeth to marry me simply to satisfy. You're not asking her to satisfy convention, you foolish boy. The Dowager stood, gathering her shawl with brisk efficiency. You're asking her because you love her, because she's saved your estate and quite possibly your sanity, and because from what I've observed in the past few hours, she loves you just as desperately in return. She moved toward the door, then paused. Though I do suggest you actually ask her properly, George. The girl deserves romance, not legal strategy. She swept from the room, leaving George and Elizabeth staring at each other across the paper-strewn desk. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the moors stretched dark and infinite beneath a sky beginning to show stars. Elizabeth. George's voice was rough with emotion. My mother is many things, but she's rarely wrong. Elizabeth felt a smile tug at her lips despite the enormity of what had just happened. About the legal loophole or about you asking me properly? Both. He came around the desk, taking her hands in his with the gentleness she'd come to treasure. Elizabeth Haven, you came to Blackwood Manor as payment for a debt I now know you never truly owed. You stayed because you chose to. You fought beside me when you could have run. You saved more than my orchids, you saved me from becoming a ghost in my own life. He drew a breath, and his storm-gray eyes held nothing but certainty. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not to silence scandal, not to satisfy convention, but because I cannot imagine spending another day without you beside me. Elizabeth looked at this man who'd offered her freedom twice and meant it both times, who defended her honor at the cost of his own reputation, who tended poisonous plants with reverent care and kissed her like she was something precious beyond measure. Yes, she whispered. Yes, George. 1,000 times yes. When he kissed her this time, it tasted of victory and promise and the beginning of something that no cousin's ambition or society's censure could ever diminish. The wedding had been small, conducted in the ancient chapel on Blackwood's grounds with only the dowager, Mrs. Hartwell, and a handful of loyal servants as witnesses. Elizabeth had worn a dress of cream silk that George's mother had somehow procured in 3 days, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, George had looked at her as if she'd hung the stars themselves. That had been 6 weeks ago, in the depths of winter's final gasp. Now, spring had arrived at Blackwood Manor with a vengeance that felt almost miraculous. Elizabeth stood in what had once been a neglected rose garden, surveying the transformation with satisfaction that bordered on disbelief. The twisted thorn bushes had been pruned back to reveal the elegant structure beneath. New plantings dotted the beds, carefully chosen specimens that would thrive in the moorland's harsh conditions. And everywhere, the first brave shoots of green pushed through soil that had been lovingly amended and enriched over weeks of patient labor. She wore a practical dress of pale green muslin, her hair caught back in a simple ribbon, and her hands were predictably dirty. The Duchess of Blackwood, she thought with wry amusement, looked remarkably like Elizabeth Haven had looked 6 months ago in her father's cottage garden. Except now she had a wedding band on her finger and a duke who insisted on working beside her until his own hands were just as stained with honest earth. "Your Grace, Lord Chancellor Pembroke's messenger has arrived." Mrs. Hartwell appeared on the garden path, her expression carefully neutral, though Elizabeth could see the tension in her shoulders. The Court of Chancery's ruling. It had been weeks since Julian's petition, weeks of testimony and legal maneuvering that the Dowager had orchestrated with ruthless precision. Elizabeth had testified herself, standing before stern-faced magistrates and describing her work with the orchids, producing her botanical journals as evidence of expertise rather than servitude. George had presented the royal charter, the letters of recommendation, the meticulous records proving Elizabeth's value to the estate extended far beyond settling a debt. Julian had fought viciously, bringing witnesses who whispered about impropriety and isolation. But he'd made one critical error: he'd underestimated the Dowager Duchess's connections and her willingness to use them without mercy. Elizabeth found George in the conservatory, as she'd known she would. He stood before the crimson orchid that had bloomed that first magical night, though now it had been joined by dozens of others, a riot of color and life that transformed the space into something extraordinary. He turned when she entered, and she saw the question in his eyes. "The messenger is here," she said quietly. They went to the study together, fingers intertwined, and George broke the seal on the official document with hands that only trembled slightly. Elizabeth watched his face as he read, saw the tension drain from his shoulders like water. "The petition is denied," he said, his voice rough with relief. "The court finds no evidence of impropriety or impaired judgment. Julian's challenge to the succession is dismissed with prejudice." He looked up, and his smile was brilliant enough to rival the spring sunshine flooding through the windows. "We won, Elizabeth." "You won." "We won," she corrected, moving into his embrace. "Together." Outside, the moors were softening under spring's touch, the harsh brown landscape giving way to hints of green and gold. The glasshouses gleamed in the afternoon light, filled with specimens that thrived under careful tending. Blackwood Manor still showed signs of neglect, but now there was money being carefully allocated, repairs being planned, a future being built with patient determination. Elizabeth Catherine Crafton, Duchess of Blackwood, rested her head against her husband's chest and listened to his heartbeat steady and strong. She'd come here as payment for a debt, stayed because she chose to, and remained because she'd found something she hadn't known to look for, a love that grew like her orchids, requiring patience and care and the courage to bloom even in the harshest conditions. If you loved Elizabeth and George's journey from desperation to devotion, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another sweeping romance. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought of their story. Did the Duke steal your heart? What was your favorite moment? I read every single comment and I love hearing from you. And if you're craving more tales of second chances, forbidden love, and happily ever afters set against the backdrop of grand estates and tangled secrets, check out the playlist I've linked below. Until our next story, keep believing in the transformative power of love, even when it blooms in the most unexpected places.